Okay, so the topic this week is incrementality. And I hope at least some of you have had a chance to look at the short video. It's only a 10-minute video on the website and on YouTube on incrementality. So as last time, I'm going to give a slightly different approach to what's on that video. So you've got two possible angles. But basically, the idea of incrementality, it's the third of the principles of the middle way we're talking about in this series. So we've already talked about skepticism and provisionality. So all of these principles, just to remind you, interlock with each other. They're completely interdependent. It's just an analysis of what the middle way involves so that we can break it up and see it more clearly. So incrementality consists of thinking in terms of degrees of qualities rather than absolute yes or no's, sometimes described as toggle switches. You know, you just move from yes to no, move between absolutes. So it's a general principle. It's also practice of the middle way to try to think in incremental terms as much as possible. So incrementality applies both to the boundaries of things and indeed people, so that we try to think in terms of matters of degree of certain qualities rather than fixed things with definite boundaries all the time, and also to change over time. So recognizing that things merge into each other over time as well. Events merge into each other. So we can avoid absolutized thinking by deliberately reflecting on the incremental nature of qualities whenever we can. So deliberately trying to move from an unreflective view of this thing is like this and has these fixed qualities that are always what it's essentially like, moving away from essentialism to thinking, well, what qualities are there in my experience regarding this thing? How does it actually appear to me? And then trying to reframe so that we think of those qualities as a matter of degree, or think of them continuously. So given that this is one of the major features of provisional thinking as opposed to absolute thinking, then this is another way of bringing ourselves more into provisional kinds of thinking. So some examples of how you could, examples of where you could think incrementally and where indeed not thinking incrementally can fairly obviously be negative in its effects. So race is an obvious example. Yes, so racism depends on thinking of people as having distinct races, as black and white, for example. But when you think about the qualities that make those up, we're talking about complex genetic features, which are a matter of degree. So Barack Obama was a great example. He wasn't totally black or white, although for some reason he was generally referred to as black. But he had a range of genetic features somewhere in between what we would normally associate with each end of that scale. Or the same with right-wing and left-wing politics. Actually, there's a number of different policy spectrums involved there, like how much state spending you approve of, how much social authority versus individualism, how much nationalism. So there's different spectrums you can talk about, which are vaguely associated with left and right-wing politics. But the important thing is not obviously just to see somebody or something as left wing or right wing, but to think in terms of, well, not just one spectrum, but in this case, many. Or more personally, so you could have a personal goal like weight loss, for example. So that's something I've been personally thinking about recently. So that can only be achieved, obviously, gradually over time. So it's a classic case of where one can be impatient and sabotage the whole process. You can only lose weight by addressing a variety of bodily, psychological, and social conditions. Or if you think about our responses to climate change. Now, however urgent a response is that is needed to climate change, it can also only happen gradually. That's just part of the conditions we're dealing with, part of any set of conditions, really, that they can only adjust gradually. They could adjust faster or slower, but they still adjust incrementally, not instantaneously. So it's wanting things to happen instantaneously, that very basic impatience, which is symptomatic of absolute thinking. So you might think, well, why do we need this incrementality? What is it about things that mean we need to think in this way, or that we can think more adequately if we think in this way? Well, one reason is, if you try and think in terms of systems, so this is where you can make use of systems theory very helpfully, I think, is that, well, the boundaries between different systems, if you think of things in terms of systems rather than fixed things, then the boundaries between systems are ambiguous. One system is always part of another system. It has systems within it, and any given system is part of lots of other systems. So think of an animal, for example. An animal is made up of cells. All of those cells are systems, but the animal is also a system. The animal is also part of the wider ecosystem. So you could say that about anything. Things are systems, and systems are part of other systems. So it's only our labeling and our terminology that lead us to start thinking in terms of things, and it depends entirely on our expectations of what those things are and where their boundaries are. Another way in which we can apply systems theory here is to think of gradual change as a property of systems. So you can't just instantaneously change a system, because the different bits of the system have to readjust in relation to each other. So it's like a crowd of people inching around a room. One of them can only move if all the others move. So instantaneous change is impossible, in a sense. We can't just magic and make things change into something else. We can adjust them, and that takes time. But there's a basic aspect of us, or at least of our conceptual beliefs, the conceptual beliefs dominated by our left hemisphere, which is not adapted to this fact of things taking time and things being ambiguous. So instead, that side of us, the absolutizing side of us, is adapted to achieving goals in a clearly defined background, what we assume to be a background where there's this thing and that thing and this other thing, which are fixed both in space and time. But we can also adapt by making our left hemisphere judgment more complex. So we can apply incremental concepts, for example, continuity, degree, gradualness, probability. So we do have concepts which can enable us to make our ideas more adequate. So to do that, we have to look more closely at whatever we're taking to be a thing, and asking ourselves what experiences make it up, what qualities give me the impression of this thing. And we may need to analyze it in terms of several different spectrums working together. So, for example, the mind, the idea of the mind is one of the biggest challenges here. It's the idea of the mind as a separate thing is a long-standing bugbear of philosophy. But if you try and think of the mind in terms of qualities, well, it's more like a quality of awareness, I would say, is the first thing that springs to mind, springs into my awareness. But there's also other qualities like locatedness. So mind seems to have a location in relation to body. You might need to think in terms of how different qualities intermesh in order to understand the assumptions we're making when we talk about a particular thing. Okay, and then just one major area to try and avoid confusions about this topic, and that's that I think it's helpful to distinguish three types of discontinuity. Very often, for example, when I raise this subject of incrementality, people will immediately say, well, what about this thing? Doesn't this change pretty quickly? Or that thing change pretty quickly? What about instant enlightenment in Buddhism, for example? Is something I often get. So maybe this analysis might help with this question. So I'm going to share a picture. Work out how to do that. Here we are. Yes. Okay. So hopefully you can see a diagram, maybe, of three types of discontinuity. So the practice of incrementality isn't about every possible kind of a discontinuity, you could say, but so we need to distinguish three of them, I think. So there's discontinuity of conditions. So obviously there are some conditions which have relatively clear-cut edges, where some conditions involving things that have relatively clear boundaries, or which change very rapidly. So they look to us like as though they're discontinuous. However, if you move in, you zoom in, as it were, you look more closely, you then usually find, in fact you always find, that they have ambiguous boundaries, or the quick change, although it's quick, is not instantaneous. So a good example of that will be death. Right, so somebody's either alive or they're dead, you might say. One moment they're alive and the next they're dead. And there's medical certification of this. There's a point of death, but anybody who's had anything to do with it, like I know Peter Goebel, who's here, has had a lot of experience with this. I mean, he's told me in the past, dying is a process. And that's quite evident, isn't it? That dying does take time. But we have, for medical purposes, to isolate a particular point conventionally in that process and say this is when death happens. So although the point that makes the most difference may happen very rapidly, it still happens over a period of time. And so the same way you can talk about tipping points in any system, things can suddenly change. When there's a weight of events in one direction, shifts the whole system. But that doesn't mean it changes instantaneously. Okay, and then the second kind of discontinuity is practical discontinuity in provisional judgments. So quite often we have to assume, obviously, that there are things and that they have boundaries and that they've changed in a distinctive way for practical purposes. When you pick up a sandwich, you assume the sandwich is there, sort of thing. You assume it's that thing. And when you go for a passport control, well, you're by necessity accepting the conventions about the boundaries of nations. But the kind of discontinuity we're trying to change here, and indeed can change in the practice of incrementality, is absolutizing discontinuity. So where it's not practically necessary, where we do have the possibility of reflecting on the objects we assume, then we can apply our awareness to that to make our thinking incremental about them. Okay. So absolutizing discontinuity, I gave the example of racism earlier already as one of those. Okay. Yeah, so that's probably all I need to say for now. So just to summarize, the key point, basically, incrementality is a practice like the other principles we're talking about, but it's also a basic way of understanding the middle way. I think it's one that's been neglected. I don't see much discussion of it around. It's obviously it does relate to certain issues in philosophy, but I can clarify that if you want me to, but that's another discussion really. But the most important focus, I think, is a practical one. There is also a lot of practical discussion about this, but it's rarely done systematically. So like people talk about things not being black and white, being a matter of degree and so on. Yeah, so this is in everyday language that we use, but I've rarely come across it as a sort of deliberate focus of reflection. And it is there also in Buddhism, yeah. So you can find in the Pali Canon that the Buddha talks about the Dharma being like the ocean, which gradually shelves, slopes, and inclines. That's in the Adana. So there are traditions and ways that they talk about this idea of incrementality. It's just a matter of making it more thoroughly part of our way of seeing things. Okay, I'm going to stop there. So, open to questions or comments. Barry.
If you're in a situation where you've been thinking incrementally and you're faced with a potentially conflictive situation, you've exhausted all possibilities, is it then appropriate to actually implement abrupt change? If I'm thinking, for example, of the American Civil War, which cost I think 1 million or so lives, but it righted a great injustice and improves the lot of of millions of people in the longer run.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's necessary implication of incrementality that all change has to be gradual. It's more that we have to be aware of the limitations of the way we are framing things if we want instantaneous change. Yeah. So the American Civil War involved abrupt change, yes, but it still took time, and there was a process by which that change happened. And of course, there were drawbacks. There were ways in which the South didn't adapt to the change that was forced on them. That it then, after the Reconstruction, it reverted back. After the liberation of the slaves, the blacks continued to be oppressed for many decades until the 60s, effectively, and lost their voting rights and so on in practice. So obviously, there were ways in which, when we try and force change, there were likely to be drawbacks, or likely to be aspects of the system that have not changed. So we need to bear that in mind if we try and make change fast. There are possible drawbacks to it. But I think that's a slightly different point from just trying to be aware of things as incremental, as changing over time, and as having gradual boundaries.
Okay, thank you.
Any other thoughts? You could.
Yeah, sorry, Robert. Can I ask if it's not something I would say, but you would, for example, come across people who say things like there has to be right and wrong, otherwise sort of we're baseless in terms of morals. I mean, what do you think would be the most helpful way of proceeding with someone who was giving that kind of argument, that we have to have sort of, if you like, absolute rights and wrongs in order to have some kind of, I don't know, moral foundation or something? Otherwise, we're all just kind of drift around in a, I don't know, relative kind of morality.
Well, I think there's a confusion there of a practical requirement for decisiveness about a moral issue with the question of how we should think about it in reflection, and whether we actually need absolutes as the way to frame the issue. I think making judgments about right and wrong in a particular situation is like the second point on the diagram I showed you earlier about different types of discontinuity. Yeah, provisionally you might decide, well, actually I have to treat this as right and this as wrong. I'm not going to accept this piece of proposed corruption in this deal, for example, or something of that kind, because I'm going to conclude that that's wrong. Yeah, that's the balance of my judgment at the moment. So yeah, you have to be decisive, but that doesn't mean that you have to be decisive by appealing to something that's absolutely known to be true, some kind of absolute belief. So that's where I think, to make our understanding of ethics sort of realistic and actually make it possible to practice ethics effectively, rather than it being a pretty ineffective institution on the whole, because people don't usually expect ethics to be always effective. We need to think about it in realistic ways, so that think of ethics as a way of stretching the inclinations we already have, stretching the feelings and the sense of what is right or wrong, through various reflections, which could be about the consequences of our actions, could be about the principles we're applying, could be about the way we're shaping ourselves, the virtues or vices we're developing. All of those kinds of reflections, which are traditional ethical reflections, can help to stretch the way we're thinking in a particular situation. But I don't think any of those moral principles has to be absolute in form. They're triggers for us to reflect ethically. But that's a big subject, and I think it could well be the subject of another talk, another point.
Yeah, so thanks. No, I appreciate that. It's just right and wrong is one that people will often think of as an absolute sort of pair, and obviously will be quite, depending on where they're coming from, will be quite attached to one way of looking at it or another way of looking at it. So, but that is something that, like I say, it's not particularly something for me, but it's something that comes up in other people's approaches to ethics, for example.
Sure. Okay. Any other thoughts?
I think there was something in the chat. There was a question.
Oh yes, Howard, do you want to ask that, Howard?
Yeah, it was just when people were talking about death as the sort of the act of dying in the example you gave, that's clearly the case if somebody has a long-term health condition, and if somebody has cancer or something, it can take a long time where somebody's terminal, but then they actually die. But and clearly when anybody dies, there's an aftermath to that, obviously. But the question I put in the chat was, well, in terms of the dying thing, if somebody dies instantaneously in a car crash, or gets shot through the head, or there's a suicide, then is that the same thing as the dying process, where it's, you know, takes a longer time?
Well, I would say it's not really about how much time it takes, because that your examples, well, they may be in conventional terms, they may be instantaneous in that we can hardly count the time it takes, but it still takes time, I'm pretty sure, even if somebody's shot through the head, for them to die. But I'm not, you know, haven't closely investigated the biology of that, but I would assume that even if it's a matter of milliseconds, it still takes time. It's not strictly instantaneous. So it's a bit like, it's the same kind of problem as what about something you're overwhelmingly confident of, you know, 99.9999% confident of, isn't that a certainty? And I'd say, no, it's not a certainty. It's what's technically known as an asymptote. It's sort of getting as close to the infinite as you can, but actually it's not. It's still something within our experience that's overwhelmingly going one way, but it's not a totality. And so to treat it exactly as a totality is problematic. Yeah, I'd have similar reasons for thinking that no event is totally instantaneous.
No.
As I would for thinking that there's no absolute certainty.
And it's one of those things where it's easy to say alive and then dead, but just because there's an abstraction in language, it makes it easy to say, doesn't? You know, we kind of think, well, therefore it must be that things go. Yeah, that's the most helpful way I've come across thinking about it.
Yeah, it's coming from our concepts. That's the thing. So
the
absolute idea is something we're imposing on it, and that absolute idea of something happening instantaneously may be relatively close to what's happening in some cases, but it's still not an absolutely correct description of what's happening.
I'd agree with that. I'd agree with that last statement. The idea of if one considers that death is a process whereby one is not conscious of what's going on anymore, and is not going to be, then that's just a speculative position to take. It's, you know, one doesn't know. One doesn't know what happens if your head is cut off with a guillotine. One doesn't know whether that the process of death, physiological death, may be delayed by matters of minutes, because the heart can continue to beat and the head is still perfused with oxygenated blood. So one doesn't know really.
Yeah.
But that's if you look at it only in terms of physiology, then you're not looking at it you're looking at it in a narrow way. You know, you're not looking at it in a provisional way. But there may be other provisional ways of looking at death that don't involve the head being connected to the body or mere physiology.
Headless chickens. Yeah. Okay, great. Willie, you have a question about Kahneman?
Yes, thanks, Robert. I was thinking about Kahneman, and I think it's called, one of his biases, the loss bias, where notoriously most change initiatives fail because there's a kind of inbuilt inertia in the system. So, you know, famously, you have to kind of have twice the amount of rewards to encourage the change, because most people will be resisting it. You know, there's an inbuilt resistance to change. So I was just thinking about that with your example of the Civil War and the unintended consequences of forcing change. And I'm just a little uncertain with incrementality. I mean, is incrementality recognizing that kind of principle of inertia, that it's just very difficult to change things, or you know, a sort of recognition of practicality, or is there more of a principle involved here, if you can see what I'm getting at.
Well, it is a principle, but it's basically, it's an aspect of the middle way. So it's an aspect of avoiding absolutization. Yeah.
Yes.
And one form that absolutization could take is trying to impose a conceptual model on the situation, which could include an ideological model, which, you know, so you have your revolution, for example, and you try and change society immediately into your ideal model.
Yeah.
And of course, there's lots of resistance and kickback to that. So it could be, you know, it's obviously related to absolutization anyway. And if you thought about change more incrementally, maybe you could make that change more effective, politically or otherwise.
Yeah, I see. Okay, thank you.
Okay, there were lots of interesting questions here, so I'm just going to push the time a little bit, if you're okay with that. So, Robin, you have a question.
Hi, yeah, just wondering if you can think of an example of a system or a process where incrementality wasn't a feature.
Well, I can't think of one involving actual people or systems in the world. You could probably come up with abstractions like mathematical ones where it wasn't, but that will be another issue.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just thought I'd pose that as a bit of a.
Come up with any?
Yeah, no, I can't. I've been
Right.
thinking, but I can't.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. Mark Pizzato.
Yes, I'm interested in the left and right hemisphere issue that you brought up. And my understanding from McGilchrist's book, which summarizes the research, is that, well, I guess I'm surprised at the term incrementality because in relation to the right hemisphere, because as I recall, I made a list, you know, to help myself, and checking that list of what he defines as right hemisphere functions or characteristics, it attends to broad fields and relationships and change, which relates to continuity that you mentioned, but more in a holistic sense, whereas incremental implies to me a kind of linear sequential examination of change. And so that would correspond more to left hemisphere characteristics according to McGilchrist.
I wouldn't say it's just linear sequential. Okay. That's not what I intend. I mean, it's more the way in which we combine left with right hemisphere functions, so how they work together. So it's another aspect, like the middle way in general, of the left being better informed by the right. And the left always having this sort of sense of having the whole story and of having the absolute view. Mm-hmm. This is one way in which it can have its absolute view challenged, and so particularly if you think of the experience of continuity. I mean, you mentioned that, but you know, we can just observe things as having continuity, whether we're observing a candle burning down, for example, or the shades of grey in a dog's coat or something. You know, so our experience can correct our tendency to think, oh, that's just a black dog, or that's just a candle that lasts 15 minutes or whatever. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I did note that from McGilchrist that the left hemisphere characteristically focuses on individual components. So maybe that's the connection that you're making between certain left hemisphere function that can focus on components, but then connecting with the right hemisphere's ability to be more contextual.
That's right. Yeah, well, you could call it reification. Yeah. Thinking in terms of things. Okay. Okay, and James has got something on binary set. We'll have to make this the last question, but yeah, James.
All right. I was just thinking of computer systems in terms of binary numbers, and it's 1 or 0, isn't it? And it functions on something either being one thing or the other.
Yeah. Well, the the binary, yeah, it is breaking down a binary way of understanding the world, because binary tends to be absolute. Yeah. And you can relate that to a computer basically being a sort of imitation of the left hemisphere rather than of the whole brain. Okay, anyway, we've got to leave it there. So I will stop the recording.